Hello everyone and welcome to my second digital talk. I have two distinguished guests and dear friends with me today, Dr. Harold Malmgren and Albert Marco. Dr. Malmgren began government service under President Kennedy as advisor to the Secretary of Defense. Under President Johnson, he was his first assistant U.S. Trade Representative. He wrote International Economic Peacekeeping in Phase 2, a guide for trade liberalization negotiations in the 70s and 80s during the time. In 1971-72, he was principal advisor to the foreign economic to President Nixon, who subsequently appointed him to principal deputy U.S. Trade Representative with the rank of ambassador. As such, he was chief U.S. trade negotiator under Presidents Nixon and Ford. Since 1977, he has pursued a stimulating and insightful career as a globally recognized financial, geoeconomic, and geopolitical strategist, and he has authored numerous peer-reviewed scholarly articles. Mr. Marco, I am writing a book on China and Russia called The Dragon Bear. Albert Marco, my second guest, has consulted with many US members of the Congress in the House of Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as other key stakeholders on Capitol Hill and in the executive branch who deal with global affairs, international security, and finance matters. Welcome, gentlemen. The title for today's talk is Disease, Disorder, Disunity, which exemplifies huge tectonic shifts in the global order with the clear trend of more disorder that are also currently being accelerated by the COVID-19 virus outbreak and which might result in more disunity in the transatlantic community. Why? Because all nations are currently acting on their own with the dire consequence for the global system. So my first question is, how do you assess the current developments and what kind of outcome do you expect in the short term? That means 12 to 18 months. And please consider also the transition period of the global system, its polarity, and also the trend of strengthening nationalism that Mr. Malmgren has been pointing to for the last several years. So, Harold, the word is yours.
Well, Velina, the world economy was already slipping into a slowdown at the end of last year. The virus pandemic became a shock to a system that was already weakening and has dramatically brought to a halt many elements of the world economy. World trade has collapsed. National production in many sectors has collapsed. And this virus, we don't yet fully understand because it is, unlike the popular description, it is not a typical flu virus. It is a virus which attacks not only the lungs, but other body organs and does damage. Even if you come out of it without deep problems, it does attack and leave behind damage to the heart, the neurological system, the kidneys. So it is unlike any such virus we have seen. For what the effects will be in the next year or two, we don't know if it will be replicated or one can be reinfected. What we have is a very deeply slowing global economy and the drivers are not reviving. China is still trapped in a deep downturn. There is growth going to pick up. It trapped in zero or very slight positive. The U.S. hopes for a rebound, but it is unlikely to show much rebound anytime this year. Probably any weekend next year. And for Europe, well, Europe already in decline before is not likely to come out a positive until 2021. So this is happening at a time of weak national leadership. We're ready or prepared. Few of the leaders have. They are in each of their countries. We have improvisation at the national level, no coherent strategy, and no attempt at international coordination other than exchange of Zoom calls, but no agenda.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Harold. Albert,
but
what is your take?
Oh, well, I mean, to carry on from what Harold was saying, I mean, what we're seeing is a resurgence of the nation state mentality, which is an inevitable outcome from the economic atmosphere, as Harold pointed out. I mean, protectionism is just a symptom of global trade contracting. I think we've seen that since 2013, I believe, it started to contract. You know, when you look at the global order, you know, capitals, specifically in the European Union, they're going to look to safeguard their own structures of power. It's an age-old phenomenon. It's nothing new. People seem to have forgotten those lessons from the days of war, you know, decades ago. But you know, this is where idealism fails in the face of realism. You know, domestic politics is what drives international relations, both politically and economically. A lot of the trade deals that Harold himself had negotiated, you know, they follow the same line of thinking. I mean, specifically the European and U.S. Agriculture trade disputes had followed along these lines, where the French and the Germans had disagreements on how to proceed with the United States. I believe Harold can touch a little bit more on that, specifically on of trade deals and multilateralism.
Mm-hmm. That reminds me of a question that is directly related to the first one. And before I ask the question, Harold, just please try to stabilize your device so that we have a better connection. Okay, so my second question that is directly related to the first one is linked to the topic of fragmentation in the transatlantic community. Albert mentioned, for instance, European Union member states. So we, of course, witnessed the situation that European member states acted on their own once the virus outbreak hit the old continent. Right now, we are already witnessing the first repercussions, economic repercussions of COVID-19. The Euro zone area, that is the area with the member states having the euro as a currency, well, plunged in a record contraction as expected. The output in the 19 countries shrank to 3.8%. In the United States, I think was 4.5%. And countries such as France and Spain have limited room to spend their way out of the pandemic crisis as compared to other countries such as Germany. So we obviously have on the old continent a situation of cleavages that probably will be strengthened, cleavages between the West and the East when it comes to rule of law, certain norms and values. But then again, we have also a cleavage between the North and the South when it comes to economic responses and financial means to adequately prepare for the time after COVID-19. So there is certainly a kind of expectation for fragmentation. Then again, we have also witnessed that on the side of the United States, the states also presented different ideas and approaches how to respond to COVID-19. My question is, do you expect that there will be more fragmentation in the transatlantic community as such? That means between the United States and Europe. And then again, these internal cleavages, would they lead to a more disunity, because this is also part of our title, to more disunity that will actually affect also the global affairs?
Well,
Harold?
I think Alberto, the situation is rising nationalism, and within nations even rising localism. For example, we are discovering we are a federation of states, and the states are each going in their own ways. In a policy, but I think the same happening in Europe. Within Europe, before we talk about transatlantic agendas, the reality is that there will be no coherence. Spain, Italy, and France want one kind of fiscal policy. Germany is agreed on only one. French, Italians, and Spanish want. Germany is busy redefining its own. Mrs. Time has come to an end, but there's no emerging. Even the CDU itself cannot yet decide on the successor. This is all happening at the time when Brexit, in theory, is moving along by the calendar more than by the Brexit may be completed this year or may not, but it will rupture relations with several countries on the continent. And I think we'll see Germany do a turnabout and become racist, and it would be France being. So it's very hard to say what will happen to global relations. We do know that the U.S. division with China is deepening. We can now see that some other countries in Europe and areas like Australia are also sharing in the discontent with China. So this is a Europe with deepening fragmentation and living that eager and reestablish relationships on a global scale. After the U.S. elections, that may change. But for the time being, there is no leader seeking the opportunity. The only leader who's talking a lot about what should be done is Macron, and he has huge power in France over foreign policy, and no power domestically. So he is a voice in the wilderness. So this is where we are.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you, Harold. Albert, what is your take? Do you do you think that the recession, the consequences from the recession would actually hit the strategic alliance of NATO and other strategic partnerships that the transatlantic community is building on? How do you see this?
Well, when you talk about fragmentation, there's two separate ways I'm looking at it. There's fragmentation within the United States, which is purely political for the upcoming election. I mean, you have state to state issues where one state wants to shut down to stress the unemployment rates and the economy to go against Trump in November's election, and then you have the Republican-led states that want to open up, for the same reason for the election. On the European side, it gets interesting because right now the Europeans have a dollar shortage, a dollar liquidity issue. Harold and I have talked about this at length for years. What they're doing now is they're jockeying for a position to get euro dollar liquidity from the United States. Unfortunately, that conflicts with the European Union's ideology of being together. France is going to do what France is going to do for their own interests. The Germans are going to do what they're going to do for their own interests. You can't blame them, realistically. The world is getting a real deep lesson right now on how important the euro dollar is to economic trade. It's the oil that greases the wheels of trade globally, and and it is so important right now for the Europeans to get a hold of it and to stabilize their own economy and keep their social programs intact. Otherwise, the people in power are going to face voters next year, specifically Macron, Merkel's successors, whoever they might be jockeying for position at the moment also.
Albert, you mentioned the euro-dollar system. Maybe you can explain in several sentences. Yeah, Harold?
Well, transatlantic from all these economic questions, what I see is a reconfiguration of interests in Europe about security, separate from the public rhetoric. The military of some of the countries in Europe beginning to together on their own agendas, particularly the Scandinavian countries are really on a separate integrated defense planning. And they are working closely with the US and UK. And Belgium and the Netherlands have joined that grouping. And now the German military, which is no longer under close management by the German government, is expressing with German industry the US-UK-led Northern European structure. So, which leaves much of the rest of Europe in limbo. There is no sector in Europe of those countries in the north in any idea that Macron is presenting. There's zero interest. As for Italy, at the far end, Italy is keenly with. So it's part of, and now it's being enhanced. And all the future development of aircraft and force capabilities will be moving in a rather different direction, with some of Europe going with it and the rest of Europe being left as orphans. I personally believe that we're going to see this merges with another configuration, which is tying in Australia and Japan in the Asian Pacific. Now, Australia is unexpectedly, in most people's thinking, is offering a vast territory, a large amount of space that is relatively uninhabited for testing weapons and training.
I think Harold got cut off, but to carry on from that,
Yeah.
You'll notice that the interconnectivity between the United States and Europe is a special partnership. Trump Trump has toned down the rhetoric of NATO's 2% threshold, as you've seen. You haven't heard a thing about it lately, and that just goes to show you how vital the European defense umbrella to the United States is a key component. As I know, the rhetoric by the politicians and the Twitter sphere is, the heck with the EU, and we should do, Trump should do everything for the United States. But the reality is, we need that defense sector. We need that umbrella. We do need the Europeans, as the Europeans need the United States.
Yeah,
there is a kind of interdependence that you don't see being hindered by the COVID-19. Even though that there are signs of disunity, you don't see, Albert, a kind of fragmentation, specifically in the security and defense sector, because this is the one side of the coin, right?
Yeah, that's one side of the
Before
coin.
we move to the other side of the coin, yeah.
Yeah, that's one side of the coin. This is probably leading into the next topic, but everyone has these key words nowadays called the global system reset. Well, that has different connotations for different people, right? One's economic, one's military, one's social. You can go down the list, right? But in my opinion, and I'd love for Harold to chime in after me, but in my opinion, there is no global reset, but more so as a global sharpening. The global order is being sharpened right now and across the lines of, where Europe stands with the United States, where Australia, where India stands in comparison to the Dragon Bear's advances geopolitically and geoeconomically across the world.
Mm-hmm. Harold?
Well, redefining the interests is necessitated by the halt of economies. So where is it that each country's interest lies? And during this downturn, which I expect will last much longer and will be much deeper, this economic downturn, than most of the social media are talking about. We're going to, what are the basic new directions in which the world economy will be moving? And in that process, many things are happening. One is, as it's widely discussed, that supply chains are being restructured because after years of building supply chains around just-in-time management of inventories and the cheapest sources, we're discovering we have to have resilience, we have to have security of supply chains, and better, we should do more of supplies locally. So all of that is at work. As the world economy begins to recover, it will be differently configured than it was a year or two ago. We're going to see big changes, interaction of interest among some countries versus others. But this leaves a question, which you'll come to, but maybe should discuss now, on that issue of Dragon Bear. What we have in Dragon Bear is a China deeply entrapped in a downturn that they cannot, because the most important part of escaping the downturn is exports. But there is no demand, no significant new demand to be expected for Chinese exports to the world. They will have to do the rebuild from within. They have that capability. we'll see. For Russia, they are really hurt by this crash in oil, and the downturn in industry worldwide means there's little demand for their resources. So an economy dependent on oil and resources is really going to be cast adrift. It will be how much do China and Russia need each other when both are of their own. I think we'll see Dragon Bear is increasingly weak, at least in terms of economic power, but that may motivate them to be more aggressive in the in the case of security. But in a way, Dragon Bear will be a side player as the world gets through this slow, painful recovery to this downturn, which has been the pandemic.
Yeah, we can, Harold. That's absolutely correct. I agree on all your points. But just to add on to that, what we're seeing is an accelerated reconfiguration away from the Chinese manufacturing dominance back into, like you said, local economies. I foresee the U.S. and North America regaining some manufacturing back here, but that, as much as the negative stuff coming out about Europe, the economy and whatnot, they actually have a really good position right now, specifically the German sector in pharmaceutical machinery. They're the leaders. I believe it's German and Swedish companies are the leaders in HVAC systems and sterile and non-sterile pharmaceutical industries. They could easily finance of manufacturing coming back into Eastern Europe and even parts of North Africa, which would then lead them to gain influence for their export economies. Germany specifically needs something to do. They need something to jumpstart their economic engine right now, specifically exports in manufacturing, because they're going to definitely lose a lot of auto sector jobs in the coming years, both because of a slowdown and because, as you said before on Twitter, they'll just move to the United States where their market is.
So you see possibilities. You clearly see possibilities for reconfiguration of global supply chains, but certainly not in the short term, rather than in the midterm, because it takes time to do so. And then again, some regions will be most likely the winners of this kind of reconfigurations. We are going to have also losers, right? So not every region or every group of countries will actually capitalize on this kind of reconfiguration. And there are indeed not so many options right now to reconfigure existing supply chains. That's a very long-term systemic process, the way I understand it. So do you actually foresee also a sort of kind of emergence of new type of alliances and partnerships when it comes to the transport, where we will basically witness also new, so to say, new free riders? India was mentioned. I suppose that Russia will also play a kind of a role of a free rider due to its shrinking geo-economic influence beyond, of course, the near uproad. And maybe you can see also other regions or other free riders in the global affairs. We also see a trend of bilateralization of the global affairs, of the international relations. How do you see this, Harold?
Yeah, when we talk about a country, India as example, India's population will exceed that of China in the next several years. And India has vast potential to be a large player. But India, again, as it has doing over the years, has been caught in domestic political confusion. And the leadership simply cannot get a grip on the Indian people and create some kind of cohesion to show that in theory should be growing at 6 to 7 and should be already a powerhouse, but it is sluggish and it can't find in dealing with other countries except a balance between doesn't want too much Russia or too much U.S. oriented, trying to of the fence, but neither coming down on one side or the other. So as long as India stays in that framework, it will not be an important factor. So then the others, the Turkey kind of situation, attempt to build a greater power structure in the region, but without economic foundation, it will not continue. It will collapse at some point. It's too fragile. Pakistan remains, again, very confused society, has nuclear weapons, has great capabilities, but can't seem to get itself organized. So will that change? Get a grip on their role? So, but yes, there will be reconfiguration of interest. Now, the supply chain thing, there are people who think we're going to major changes in the U.S. relationship with China regarding supplies. I think it's going really fast. I think we're going to separate the supplies, not only healthcare and pharmaceutical, in semiconductors, evolution in thinking in the U.S. to make that all those microprocessors inside the U.S. or inside North America. Perhaps relying more heavily on Taiwan, but I think change rapidly. And the ties or potential ties with China in area 5G, that's being reshaped as we regress to allow Huawei to play a large role. That's all being rethought. The pandemic is creating another focus, and that is how to manage physical and other forms of security. And I think we're going to see increasing cooperation among unlikely neighbors. That is, I think Germany and the UK and the US actually cooperate very closely on enhanced surveillance and less China. The German political leadership may agree with that, but I think it will happen. They're going to find a different way of proceeding, and the governments, particularly the German government, will be coming from behind, trying to keep up.
Yeah, Harold, I agree on all those points again, and we've discussed this on Twitter at length. Specifically, when you mentioned India, when we start talking about reconfiguration, it's really necessary to actually measure it out sector by sector. Manufacturing, without a doubt, is coming back to both the European borders and American borders. But when you start talking about, like in the pharmaceutical industry, there's something called active pharmaceutical ingredients. They're pollution heavy. The United States and Europe have strict environmental laws, whereas India doesn't. So those APIs will definitely stay within India. The Germans could definitely lead something back to Europe side in maybe Turkey, Egypt. This type of reconfiguration, although starts with the United States and the Federal Reserve providing liquidity, branching out to the UK, with the Germans, with the Austrians, with the French, and this exactly like you were discussing, Harold, a tightly knit group, looking at what sectors that they can advance their economic interests in. The Germans, as much as like I said, as much as I like to pick on the Germans every once in a while, they are the economic leader of Europe. They still, going forward, will be the economic leader of Europe. But all this is going to be financed by London. So, like you said, they will be very tightly knit, and I see cooperation actually exceeding all our expectations, even our most optimistic one, going forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there is the way I see it and the way you outlined it, there is a role also for the European Union member states and for the European Union as a collective actor. Let me remind you that there will be a decision on the 6th of May by the OICU, that is the Council, the European Council. Basically, these are the decision makers from the member states on a recovery fund, and it is allegedly going to be around 1.5, maybe to even 2 trillion of euro that will be offered for the next, probably 1-2 years at least, for the member states to basically try to revive their economies. So, and Albert also mentioned the UK. There will be indeed also cooperation between the European Union member states and UK, specifically in the field of security and defense. But then again, one issue has to be covered as well, and we haven't talked about it yet, and that is the global finance and monetary system, right? We've witnessed unprecedented steps, unprecedented measures also, whatever it costs, basically, by the central banks of the developed economies, led by the Federal Reserve. And I would like to hear your opinion on that, where we are heading with all of this. It was right to be done on the one side, but it also reminds us of another time, during the great financial crisis, when we witnessed a situation in which the too big to fail relevant corporations, organizations were bailout and saved. Right now, we are sliding in a similar situation where, corporations, organizations, offshore companies are trying to get the bailout. But then again, we are seeing economies plunging. So isn't it the situation in which we should actually see bailouts for the too many to fail this time? That means the ordinary citizens, the small businesses, the entrepreneurs, those people who actually can contribute to reviving our economies. And Albert, you also mentioned the euro-dollar system, and when we talk about global finance system, I think that there is a lack of understanding of what it means and how actually interconnected American and European finance systems are. And we have, of course, witnessed already prior to the COVID-19 situation of global liquidity crisis. These are systemic issues that we have to address if we are going to talk about, the day after, right? So what is your take on that? And I will like to hear the opinion of both of you. Harold.
Yeah, I hate to be rude about this, but I will be very, very simple. the only central bank that matters in the world today is the Federal Reserve. Oversees a group of banks that are all suffering from non-performing loans and dysfunction, and industries in Europe and Asia do not get financing from European banks. They get that financing from banks that borrow in dollars. So what mainly it is London which supplies the huge capital base for global finance, not the European. And you know, in the U.S., our industry doesn't depend on banks. It depends on access to through bonds and other. Same, the banks are not very important. Only function is the ECB additional dollars through swap lines. So the ECB is just a let's say, needy cousin in the management of world finance. I know it sounds rude, but really the reality. Now, where this is all going, not in a good direction, because what the central banks led by the US are doing is saving large institutions and large institutions. Past practices, we're creating moral hazard, but we are not saving small business, or as you might say in Germany, the Mittelstand. So the wealth and income inequality is again, only this time widening even more than it did after the 2008 crisis. So big challenge in the year and a half to be whether governments can come to terms with the reality that ordinary people will be worse off, much worse off, than they were before all this, before the pandemic. Everybody's going to be much worse off. The only people better off are the owners of very large institutions, many of which are managed. So we making worse by all the policies, including, no doubt, the policies that Europe will come forward with to save troubled companies. This is the problem of the poor much bigger, politically, sooner or later, and maybe in different ways in each country. We are in time where the very social fabric is going to be torn by widening disparity. And the longer that the downturn lasts, the more political fear will be the pressure forced.
Okay.
Yeah, you know,
Albert?
just a little background on that. So the Eurodollar system, like I've described many, many times before, it is the only currency in the world right now. The ECB gets dollars, and from there, it credit multiplies it out. And what you're seeing today is nothing more, to go on to what Harold was saying, is the political structure in Europe trying to maintain the status quo. You know, that's all they're doing. They're not fixing anything. They're just maintaining the status quo. And because the Federal Reserve is pumping in liquidity, you don't see a W-shaped recovery. You're just going to see a V-shaped recovery until they can legitimately kick the can down the road in another 10 years. But in about another 10 years, we're going to see the same issues pop up again. The problem is, like Harold was saying, the public is the one bearing the brunt of all this. And the longer that this occurs, the bigger problem that you're going to see with populism arising within Europe and even within the United States. You know, the extremes start taking control of the narratives, and this is not a healthy system.
Okay. Would you like to add something to the other points of Harold, Albert, before we move to the next question? because it was not just about the euro-dollar
No,
system, it was also about the financial system, the global liquidity crisis. You are propagating strengthening of the US dollar, but then again, if we keep this track, where is this leading us? Is there going to be a transition of the global finance system? Because the system, the way it works right now, is not a sustainable way.
Well,
So every next shock.
the only way that you have a transition of a global financial order is if you have multipolarity. We do not live in a multipolar world, not financially, not technologically, not militarily. That's just the reality of it. And I know some people don't want to hear that because they have grand ideas of how the Europeans and how Europe works and China and Russia and whatnot. But this is not a multipolar world. So long as the United States is the superpower status, that it's just the dollar is it. There is nothing else. The dollar and the Fed. There is nothing else under the foundation of it at the moment.
I see.
The only central bank that matters is the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
Okay. My long-term systems of use. Harold, just a second. And you can elaborate further, because Albert made a point that I can build my next question on, and you can also add your points to it, Harold. So my main long-term global system scenario.
You cut out a second, Valina, but go ahead, Harold. Go ahead and make the point about what you were going to say about the Federal Reserve and central banks.
Well, the only way to get a new arrangement would be for there to be agreement among several key governments to what they are doing, sovereignty over their monetary financial to some group. But nobody's ready to do that. Not the US, but no government in Europe is willing to yield sovereignty over its financial structure. They can't even yield to each other within the European Union. It's an impasse. It continues. The friendship year after year always flouted whatever ruling there was and got away with it because of France. There is no possibility for an international agreement. So the system we have is a system which will continue. The IMF.
And that's why we don't see the Plaza Accord 2.0.
Yeah, this special drawing rights idea is still floating around, but nobody will agree to it.
Yeah, okay. Valina, welcome back. Oh, we can't hear you, Valina.
Valina is disconnected.
Oh, well, like I just asked you, Harold, there's a lot of talk about Plaza Accords 2.0, but just as you specified, what leadership takes control and what leaders come together and could even discuss that at the moment?
Well, I think has tried to organize some meetings over Zoom of the G7 or the G20, but it's more theater than anything else, because there is no one out. Name 3 or 4 leaders you are meeting who have power to decide anything. I mean, when I go through each country, I can't find what power are able to make a decision. Boris Johnson could make some decisions, but he seems preoccupied with internal UK matters for the moment. As Brexit, maybe the British could play a role.
Mhm.
But there's no leader, not a single leader on the continent of Europe, Asia, maybe with the exception of Singapore, or I guess we'd have to say there was a strong leader in North Korea, but not relevant to this issue.
Yeah.
But there's no one to come to. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I agree. Valina, are you there? Oh, we can't hear you, Valina.
Yeah,
I think her microphone is
the
off.
system has.
Has failed us once again. Harold, really quick, one subject that we haven't talked about is actually the supply chains for food, because it's been in the media lately that there's food shortages globally. I like to divide that up because, I mean, the United States is pretty self-reliant when it comes to food. I think the biggest stress point that we see is parts of Europe and obviously China.
Yes. China cannot feed itself with the territory it has. It can fish the South Sea enough protein for the Chinese people, the size of the population. So China depends on the world. And many other countries also depend on the world, particularly many countries are dependent on U.S. exports of food because we are a food surplus generator. We have problems inside the U.S. Because this system for distribution of food is split in two. One system to supply retail grocery chains, and the other system to supply commercial users. And the food is packaged differently, labeled differently, sent by different trucks and trains. So we're now going through a terrible problem. How do we move food from the commercial side, which is going to waste, over to the retail side? But the food supplies, most countries are going to continue to depend on world food distribution systems because very few countries are self-sufficient. So I would say one of the areas of common interest is going to emerge on simply feeding nations. There will be an interest to make more coherent how to move food around.
Mm-hmm.
It will be an area of common interest that politicians can agree on, even though it sounds mundane to people who are fascinated by Wall Street and the London market.
Interesting.
Can
Melina,
you hear me now?
Yes, we can, Melina.
Great.
Yes, you're
Sorry.
back. Thank you.
COVID-19, sorry guys for that, but we have to adapt very quickly to the reality of digitalization. And I'm really sorry that I couldn't ask my question till the end, but I'm using the opportunity to do it now before the internet decides to kick me off once again. And that is that in my long-term global system scenario, I see two possibilities. On the one side, either a systemic decoupling. I called a systemic rivalry between United States and China already in 2014, 2015. Now we are already witnessing this kind of systemic rivalry unleashing in all relevant systems. But it might be also possible to witness a systemic coexistence. That means a US-led bloc, the way how you described it, certainly with European allies, but also with allies in other parts of the world, in the Indo-Pacific region, in the Latin American continent, in Africa. And then again, we will probably see a China-led bloc with the Dragon Bear that we've outlined for our listeners, and also with other key partners. What kind of possibility do you foresee for the global order in the next decade?
Big question, Belina. I guess the key question is, can China's One Belt, One Road survive? Has extended reach very widely, but it's built on borrowed money. It's a debt-driven system encompassing many countries. One can wonder whether it's possible for China to develop permanent relations with much of Africa when the history of Africa has been for local governments to kick out and simply nationalize resources whenever it suited them. Will the Chinese be able to carry the burden of this huge debt structure? Can the Chinese nation sustain this really big defense security spending program alongside this fragile, debt-driven One Belt, One Road structure? There are a lot of stresses in China, and to me does not yet show signs of any signs of real recovery. Now, maybe substantial political ramifications inside China. When I talk with politicians in Washington, members about China, work through these problems, the answer every time is it's too big, can't last. It's interesting that politicians size it up that way. And it is a question. Can China continue to make 1.3 or 1 billion people, one structure, with all of its efforts worldwide in jeopardy and dependent on extremely high defense security? It's a big one. Russia, in part, Russia has huge military capabilities, but under Putin, its agenda is to act as a destabilizing force in as many places as possible, so as to remain relevant. Russia doesn't want to go to war. It will avoid going to war. So it's without coherent global strategy. So Dragonberry is a sickly monster with a mind which is in transition, but I don't know whether it's going towards nervous breakdown or a more coherent way.
Yeah, if I can interject, Harold, speaking on your thesis, whether it's a decoupling or if there's some kind of stabilization between the U.S. and China, I lean on the side of a more reserved aspect where the U.S. and China will find some sort of happy medium. Supply chains, although some manufacturing is going to leave at an expedited rate, not all of it's going to leave. It's expensive. It's timely. There's a lot of stress on the system for that to happen. So there will be some sort of cohesive nature, but I don't think that actually happens until new leadership enters the fray, both in the United States and in China. Right now, Xi is having domestic issues with the Deng family out of Guangdong. That's where the economic heart of China is at the moment, and they're not happy with Xi for good reason. This trade dispute has gone well over any of the estimates that they've come up with, and has been hurting the pockets of the wealthy elite in China. So they're not going to stand for it. Structures of power, they move where money moves. So they'll find a way to get rid of Xi, and once that happens, and then at that point, I believe the United States and China can find some kind of cohesion.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have two questions from the audience. This will be our last two questions. Please keep it short. The one is, um, doesn't a shift in reliance to India lead to vulnerability? And the other one is, what kind of an alternative to the US dollar do you foresee to emerge? So alternative to the US dollar as a kind of a reserve or a second currency. What is your take on that?
What's the first question again?
The first question is, doesn't a shift in reliance to India, what you've outlined in terms of reconfigurations of supply chains towards India, so there is a question in this regard, whether this reliance on India might not lead to vulnerabilities?
Well, India is within the sphere of the U.S. umbrella militarily and economically. They're within the Commonwealth, so they have, deep networks tied to the United States and the UK. So I don't think that that's necessarily a vulnerability. Harold mentioned a long time ago the Chinese and India tensions on their border. You could definitely see the Chinese act to try to stress the Indians in that aspect, especially if they're taking away economic gain from the Chinese.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And second question was about alternative to the US dollar.
Well, let Harold answer the Indian part.
Well, yeah, 2 points. Just of India and the United States, we have to keep in mind we are in a time in history where artificial intelligence of advanced computers every couple, 3 decades or longer. And if you look at the U.S., if you go around all our universities to look at the computer departments, you find in most of them the head of the department Indians and uncle with whom he works night and day. The interaction of India, U.S. is really deep. So, regarding the alternative, everybody wants one, seems to talk about one, see any alternative at any time soon, maybe a few years from now. But for the time being, there is no alternative. Every country is short of liquidity. Banks led by the Reserve is creating more liquidity. What he needs is dollars, not local currency. And it's because any expansion of an economy anywhere that involves international business requires dollars to function. A system concocted by the IMF would simply not be acceptable to most governments. He's in trouble. What does it do? It turns to the Fed and says, can we send you some euros and you send us some fresh dollars in exchange, called swap lines. U.S. is continuously bailing out the ECB. There is no alternative. So maybe it's time for everybody to acknowledge, all right, that's the way the world works.
Yeah, again, Harold, that's correct. I mean, when you're talking about an alternative to the dollar, it's not a simple answer of economics and debts and numbers on a piece of paper. There's military and political components to such a system. There is no other alternative right now that can replace the dollar politically, militarily, economically. It doesn't exist at the moment. You would have to have the United States fall from grace and then have another power come up and start taking over supply chains and economic and trade deals. Where do you see that right now? The Chinese are taking a step back. The Europeans have no military to speak of. So where does this thought of multipolarity come from? It's nothing more than fantasy, in my opinion. So in the foreseeable future, it is the dollar, and that's the end. That's case closed in my book.
Mm-hmm. Okay, gentlemen. So I think that we've managed, despite all the technical difficulties, to have a very nice 1 hour wrap up of current systemic processes and developments. And we addressed most relevant issues, specifically related to the US-China rivalry, emerging regional powers, and also relevant issues related to the key socioeconomic systems. And by doing so, I think that we basically gave a 30,000 foot view on the global system, for which I really, really thank you. Thank you for being with me in the last hour, and thank you to our listeners and watchers for the patience and for the interest. And yes, we will continue covering these issues. We all three of us are available also on social media, on our Twitter accounts, and like I said, we are writing a book on the Dragon Bear, on the relevance of the systemic coordination between China and Russia, and hopefully this book will emerge not late than the US presidential elections, because there will be changes not only in the global system but also in our political systems. So yes, I'm looking forward to having you once again on my talk next month, hopefully. Thank you very much, Harold and Albert.
Thank you, Valina.
Right, thanks, Valina.